My name is Ruby Wood. I'm 32 years old, and until recently, I worked as a senior client operations coordinator for a mid-sized consulting firm in London. If you had met me back then, maybe in the office kitchen, pouring tea, or quietly taking notes during a meeting, you probably wouldn't have remembered me afterward. Not because I was unfriendly. I've always been polite, reliable, the kind of person who replies to emails quickly and never forgets a deadline. But people tend to mistake calm for small. At work, I was the person who made sure everything ran smoothly behind the scenes. I prepared presentations that other people delivered. I organized client schedules that executives proudly took credit for managing. I fixed problems before they were noticed. And because I didn't complain about it, people assumed I didn't mind, or maybe they assumed I didn't notice. The truth is, when you're the quiet one in the room, people often speak more freely around you. They make decisions about you as if you're not quite present. They underestimate what you see, what you remember, and what you understand. For a long time, I allowed that. Not because I was weak, not because I lacked ambition, but because I believed that patience, competence, and professionalism would eventually speak for themselves. This story isn't about revenge. It's about something much quieter than that. It's about the moment you realize the role people have assigned you and the quiet decision you make when you decide you're no longer going to play it. The turning point came on a day that was supposed to be one of the happiest days of my life, my wedding day, a day that had been planned for over a year. One day, my family traveled across countries to attend, a day that, in my mind, marked the beginning of a different chapter of my life. But 3 days before the ceremony, my boss sent me a message. He said a client call couldn't be rescheduled, and he expected me to be on it during my wedding. What he didn't expect was what happened when the client learned why I wasn't available, or how that moment would quietly change the course of several people's careers, including his. This isn't a dramatic story filled with shouting or revenge. It's about observation, memory, patience, and the quiet kind of power people rarely notice until it's already too late. So, before we go any further, let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a place where people assumed you were too quiet to matter? In the office where I worked for nearly 6 years, people described me using the same three words: reliable, organized, quiet. None of them meant it as an insult. In fact, most people said it with a kind of casual appreciation, like they were describing a well-made appliance that always worked when you needed it. Ruby will handle it. Ruby knows where that is. Just ask Ruby. And most of the time, they were right. I did know where things were. I knew which client preferred calls before noon and which one insisted on written summaries afterward. I knew which executive liked their presentation simplified and which ones wanted every data point visible. I knew when contracts were about to expire before anyone else noticed. I knew which projects were quietly falling behind schedule long before the weekly reports reflected it. But knowing things and being seen are two very different experiences. When meetings happened, I was almost always there, but rarely in the center of the conversation. I prepared the documents, I tracked the timelines, I wrote the follow-up emails that clarified decisions people barely remembered making. Sometimes someone would even say, halfway through a meeting, "Ruby, can you remind us what we agreed on last time?" And I would, calmly, precisely. People appreciated that. But appreciation is not the same thing as authority. Over time, a quiet pattern formed around me. When a project succeeded, the people presenting it received praise. When a problem appeared, the room would slowly turn toward me to fix it. Not in a cruel way, just naturally, like gravity. The strange thing is that I didn't resent it at first. For a long time, I told myself something very simple. Competence eventually speaks for itself. If you do good work consistently enough, people notice. At least, that's what I believed. And in some ways, the job suited me. I'm not someone who enjoys loud competition or office politics. I prefer clarity, structure, solving problems quietly, but there's a difference between choosing calm and being placed in the background. The person who placed me there most consistently was my direct manager. His name was Daniel Mercer. Daniel was the kind of leader who filled a room the moment he entered it. Confident voice, expensive suits, the sort of charisma that makes clients feel reassured before he's even finished introducing himself. People liked him, and to be fair, he was very good at bringing in business. But Daniel had a habit. He treated reliability as something permanently available. If a meeting needed preparation at the last minute, he assumed I could do it. If a client needed something reorganized overnight, he assumed I'd stay late. Not because he asked rudely, but because he never asked at all. He simply expected it. And for years, I delivered. Not dramatically, not resentfully, just quietly. If you had asked my colleagues back then who I was in the office, they would probably have described me as the dependable one, the calm one, the one who never caused problems. What they didn't realize was that quiet people observe more than they reveal. Every passing comment, every casual assumption, every moment someone decided my time mattered a little less than theirs. I noticed all of it. I just didn't react. Not yet, because at that point, I still believed something important. I believed the system was fair enough that patience would eventually balance things out. I believed professionalism would be recognized. And I believed that when something truly important came along, people would understand. I didn't realize how wrong that assumption was, not until the first small moment that showed me exactly how invisible I had become. The first moment that stayed with me wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no obvious insult, just a small moment that everyone else in the room forgot within minutes. It happened during a Monday strategy meeting about 2 years before my wedding. Our team had just secured a new international client, an expanding logistics company preparing to enter the European market. It was the kind of contract that made senior leadership visibly happier. Daniel walked into the conference room that morning with the energy of someone who had already won something. "Good news," he said, placing a folder on the table. "They've agreed to move forward with the full consulting package." There were smiles around the table. New contracts meant bigger numbers, bigger expectations, and, most importantly for leadership, bigger visibility. As usual, I had already prepared the background material. Over the weekend, I organized the client's expansion plans, regulatory concerns, and operational timelines into a summary document. I had also included something else, a potential risk. It wasn't dramatic, just a logistical detail I had noticed while reviewing their shipping routes. One of the regulatory approvals they expected to receive within 3 months historically took closer to 6. If that delay happened, it would affect the entire project timeline. So, when Daniel began outlining the strategy, I waited until he paused and then spoke up. "Daniel," I said, keeping my voice calm, "there may be a regulatory delay in the Rotterdam port approval. Historically, it's taken closer to 6 months. If that happens, the Phase 2 timeline might need adjusting." The room went quiet for a moment, not because what I said was shocking, but because people weren't used to me interrupting. Daniel looked at me for a second, then gave a quick smile. "It'll be fine," he said lightly. "The client is confident they'll get it through faster this time." He turned back to the whiteboard and continued explaining the rollout schedule. The meeting moved on. No one argued with him, no one asked further questions. And technically, that was the end of it. Except that 3 months later, the exact delay I had mentioned happened. The regulatory approval stalled. The project timeline shifted. Several deliverables had to be reorganized, which meant a new emergency meeting. This time, the room felt different, less confident, more tense. Daniel stood at the front again, explaining the situation. "It looks like the port authorization may take up to 6 months, he said. "We'll need to adjust Phase 2 accordingly." There were murmurs around the table. Someone asked, "Did we know this was a possibility earlier?" Daniel paused for half a second. Then he said something that most people probably didn't notice. "Yeah, it's something we became aware of recently." The conversation moved on. No one questioned the statement. No one remembered the Monday meeting from 3 months earlier. But I did. Not because I wanted credit, and not because I expected him to mention my name. What stayed with me was something subtler. It was how easily the room accepted the new version of the timeline, as if the earlier conversation had never happened. That was the moment I started realizing something important about visibility in professional space. It's not only about who has the best ideas, it's about who people expect to hear them from. When someone already fits the image of authority, their words carry weight automatically. When someone doesn't, their observations can disappear into the background, even when they're correct. I didn't challenge Daniel afterward. I didn't send a follow-up email reminding anyone of what had been said. I simply wrote a short note in my black leather notebook that evening. Regulatory delay predicted. Meeting 14th of March. At the time, it wasn't an act of strategy. It was just a habit. I liked keeping records of things that mattered. Looking back now, That small moment was the first quiet shift in how I began seeing the office around me, not as a perfectly fair system, but as a pattern. And once you start noticing patterns, it becomes very difficult to stop. After that meeting about the Rotterdam delay, nothing dramatic changed in the office. No confrontations, no apologies, no sudden recognition of what had happened. Life at the firm simply continued. And for a while, I told myself that the moment didn't matter. Daniel hadn't insulted me. He hadn't taken direct credit for my observation either. If anything, the situation could easily be explained away as a misunderstanding or a forgotten detail. People forget things in meetings all the time. That's what I told myself. But once your attention has been drawn to a pattern, small moments start appearing everywhere. A few weeks later, I prepared an operations summary for a client presentation. It included a simplified chart showing the most cost-effective shipping sequence for their first 6 months of expansion. I had spent nearly 2 evenings building it, not because anyone asked for something that detailed, but because I knew the client valued visual clarity. If the chart made the decision process easier, the presentation would move faster. When the meeting happened, Daniel presented the slide deck I had assembled. Halfway through, he reached the chart. "This model helps clarify the sequence," he said, pointing to the graphic. "It simplifies the logistics during the early phase." The client nodded. One of their executives leaned forward. "That's very clear," he said. "Did your team build this model internally?" Daniel smiled in that relaxed way he had with clients. "Yes," he said. "We put it together this week." Technically, that wasn't untrue, but I remember sitting at the side of the room, watching the conversation continue, and realizing something subtle. The room never looked toward me. No one asked who had built the model. No one wondered. Because in their minds, the answer had already been decided. Daniel was the strategist. I was the person who organized things. And once people assign roles like that, they stop questioning them. Again, I didn't feel angry in that moment. If anything, the feeling was closer to quiet understanding. This was simply how the environment worked. Authority gathered attention. Support remained invisible. Over time, I began noticing other small things. If a deadline approached suddenly, Daniel would say, "Ruby will coordinate it." If a client requested additional documentation late in the evening, he would forward the email to me with a short message. "Can you handle this tonight?" "Could you?" "Not." "Is that possible?" Just the assumption that I would. And most of the time, I did. Partly because I took pride in doing my job well, but also because pushing back would have created friction. And at that stage of my career, friction felt risky. So instead, I made quiet adjustments inside my own thinking. When someone took credit for an idea, I told myself the project mattered more than recognition. When my evenings disappeared into last-minute tasks, I told myself this was temporary. Hard work eventually gets noticed. That belief kept everything feeling reasonable. It allowed the pattern to continue without open conflict. And the truth is, Daniel probably didn't think of himself as unfair. From his perspective, the system was working perfectly. Clients were happy. Projects were delivered. The team supported him efficiently. Why question something that appears successful? The interesting thing about normalized disrespect is that it rarely looks like cruelty. It looks like a habit, a series of small assumptions that repeat so often, they become invisible. For nearly 4 years, I allowed those assumptions to shape my place in the office. Reliable, organized, quiet. The person who made things work. The person who stayed late. The person who never objected. And because I never objected, everyone assumed the arrangement was fair. At the time, I assumed that too. I thought patience would eventually balance the scales. I thought consistency would slowly change how people saw me. What I didn't realize was that by staying silent for so long, I had helped create a role that was almost impossible to escape, a role that would follow me all the way to the most important day of my life. And that's when the expectations became impossible to ignore. By my 5th year at the firm, my position in the office had become very clear, at least to everyone else. I was the person who kept everything together, not the person who led the strategy, not the person who spoke the loudest in meetings, but the person who made sure the system never broke. If a presentation needed polishing, I handled it. If a client suddenly requested additional documentation, I prepared it. If a schedule collapsed because someone forgot a deadline, I reorganized it. Over time, my colleagues began describing me in ways that sounded positive on the surface. Ruby is amazing under pressure. She's incredibly dependable. Nothing falls apart when Ruby's around, and I appreciated the kindness behind those comments. But what people didn't notice was the quiet expectation hidden inside them. Dependable people become permanently available. Once others believe you will always solve the problem, they stop imagining a situation where you might not. Daniel, especially, seemed to rely on that assumption. If a client asked for something complicated, he didn't ask whether I had time. He simply forwarded the request. Sometimes the email would arrive late in the evening, sometimes on a Sunday, occasionally even during holidays. The message was almost always short. Ruby will coordinate this. At first, I treated those moments as signs of trust. Being relied on meant I was valuable. But gradually, I noticed something else. Trust normally comes with acknowledgement. Responsibility without acknowledgement feels different. It feels more like ownership, as if your time belongs to the system rather than to you. One afternoon, a newer employee named Mark joined our team as a junior analyst. He was talented, energetic, and eager to impress. During his second week, he sat next to me while preparing a data summary for one of Daniel's presentations. After watching me organize a complex project timeline, he leaned slightly closer and said something that stayed with me. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. "Of course. Why aren't you a manager here?" The question surprised me. I smiled a little. "That's a good question," I said. Mark frowned slightly, studying the spreadsheet in front of him. "You basically run half the projects I've seen," Prince said. "I just assumed you were senior leadership." I remember pausing for a moment before answering, because his assumption revealed something interesting. From the inside of the work itself, my responsibilities looked like leadership. But from the outside of the room, the place where titles and authority lived, the role assigned to me was different. I was the reliable operator, the person who ensured that plans worked, not the person who was expected to own them. "Titles don't always reflect the work people do," I finally told him. Mark nodded slowly, though he still looked puzzled. At the time, I didn't feel bitter about that reality. I had a stable job, a supportive partner at home, and a life that felt balanced outside the office. My fiancé, Thomas, often reminded me of something simple. "Work is important," he would say, "but it's not the whole story." And for the most part, he was right. The office was just one part of my life. But roles, especially invisible ones, have a way of growing quietly stronger over time. The longer you play them, the more people expect them to remain unchanged. Reliable, organized, always available. By the time my wedding approached, that expectation had become so normal that no one, not even Daniel, thought to question it. Which is why what happened next surprised him more than anyone, because for the first time in years, I chose not to fit the role. The shift didn't happen in the office. It happened on a quiet Saturday afternoon in my apartment, about 4 months before the wedding. Thomas and I were sitting at the small dining table that had slowly become our planning station. Guest lists, venue confirmations, seating charts, every surface seemed to hold some small piece of the ceremony we had been building for over a year. Outside, London was gray in the familiar way it often is, light rain against the windows. The kind of afternoon that encourages slow conversations and cups of tea that stay warm in your hands. Thomas was reviewing the final schedule that the venue had sent us. "The ceremony starts at 2, he said, tracing a line across the page. "Reception at 4, speeches around 6. I nodded, half listening, while checking an email that had arrived from work. A client had requested a revised document for Monday morning. Nothing unusual. I closed my laptop again and returned my attention to the table. "You're doing it again," Thomas said gently. "Doing what?" "Working during wedding planning." He didn't sound annoyed, just observant. I smiled slightly. It was quick. Thomas studied me for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "Can I ask you something honestly?" he said. "Of course. When was the last time you said no to your boss?" The question was simple, but I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I tried to think of a moment. A clear memory of declining a request, setting a boundary, saying that something couldn't happen because my time mattered too. Nothing came to mind. Thomas watched the silence settle between us. "That's what I thought," he said softly. Again, there was no accusation in his voice, just curiosity. "I don't mind working hard," I replied after a moment. "I know you don't," he said. "That's not what I'm asking." He tapped the schedule on the table. I'm asking whether they understand that your life exists outside the office. The room became quiet again, because that question carried something deeper than the first one. It wasn't about effort, it was about an assumption. For years, my colleagues had assumed I would always be available, always capable, always willing to solve the next problem. And because I had never challenged that assumption, it had quietly become permanent. Thomas folded the schedule and looked at me with a thoughtful expression. You know what I've always admired about you? He said. What? You notice everything. I laughed softly. That's not always a good thing. It is when you choose what to do with it. He stood up and carried our empty cups to the kitchen sink before adding one more sentence over his shoulder. Just make sure the people who rely on you understand that reliability isn't the same as ownership. That line stayed with me longer than the rest of the conversation. Reliability isn't ownership. For the first time in years, I began looking at the office from a slightly different angle. Not as a place where my value was defined by how much I could quietly carry, but as a system of expectations I had helped create. If people assumed my time was always available, it wasn't only because they believed it. It was also because I had never shown them otherwise. The realization didn't make me angry. If anything, it felt clarifying, calm, a quiet shift in perspective. I didn't walk into the office on Monday with a dramatic plan. I didn't confront Daniel or demand recognition. Instead, something subtler changed. For the first time, I began seeing my silence not as a habit, but as a choice. And once you realize silence is a choice, you start asking a different question. Not why people expect things from you, but whether you're still willing to give them. The Monday after that conversation with Thomas, I arrived at the office a little earlier than usual, not because there was extra work waiting for me, just because I wanted a quiet hour before the day began. The office was nearly empty when I stepped inside. The cleaning staff had just finished, and the lights along the corridor were still half dimmed. My desk looked exactly as I had left it on Friday. Orderly stacks of folders, a closed laptop, and my small black leather notebook resting beside the keyboard. For years, that notebook had simply been a habit. Whenever something important happened in a meeting, an agreement, a deadline, a decision, I wrote it down. Dates, names, small contextual notes, nothing dramatic, just details. Most people trusted their memory, I trusted records. That morning, I opened the notebook and flipped through the pages slowly, meeting summaries, client commitments, timeline adjustments, promises that had been made casually in conversations and then quietly forgotten later. Looking at the pages now, something felt different. Not because the information had changed, but because my perspective had. For years, those notes had been purely practical, a way to ensure projects ran smoothly. Now I began to see them as something else. A map of patterns, patterns of how decisions were made, patterns of who spoke in meetings and who didn't, patterns of whose ideas were remembered and whose quietly disappeared. None of it was shocking, but seeing everything together created a kind of clarity, and clarity has a calming effect. When you understand how a system works, you stop expecting it to behave differently without reason. Around 9 o'clock, the rest of the team began arriving. Keyboards clicked on, coffee machines hummed, conversations drifted across the open office space. Daniel arrived last, as he usually did. He walked past my desk with his usual confident energy. "Morning, Ruby," he said, already glancing at his phone. "Morning." He paused for a second. "Client update meeting this afternoon," he added. "I'll need a revised operations summary before lunch." For years, I would have immediately opened the project files and started working. Instead, I simply nodded. Of course, but something subtle had changed inside that response. Before, my silence meant automatic compliance. Now it meant observation. Throughout the morning, I noticed how often people relied on assumptions about my availability. Emails forwarded with a short line. "Ruby will organize this." Calendar invitations were scheduled without checking whether I was free. Requests framed not as questions, but as conclusions. None of it felt hostile. It was simply normal. And because it was normal, no one noticed when I made a small adjustment that day. I still completed the revised summary Daniel requested. I still coordinated the meeting materials. But I also started doing something new. I documented everything, not only decisions, but expectations. If someone assigned work without asking, I wrote down the exact phrasing. If a deadline shifted unexpectedly, I recorded who changed it and when. If a client expressed appreciation for something the team had produced, I made a quiet note of the details behind it. Again, none of this felt dramatic. It felt organized. Strategic silence doesn't require confrontation. Sometimes it simply requires attention. Over the next few weeks, that attention grew sharper. And because I remained calm, because I continued doing my work professionally, no one suspected anything had changed. From the outside, I was still the same person they had always known: reliable, organized, quiet. But internally, something important had shifted. My silence was no longer a passive habit. It had become a deliberate position. And while everyone around me interpreted that silence as continued agreement, I was quietly preparing for the first moment when agreement would no longer apply. The moment when the role they expected me to play would finally stop fitting. If someone had walked past my desk during the weeks that followed, nothing about my routine would have looked unusual. I still arrived early most mornings. I still organized project timelines, prepared client documentation, and coordinated meeting schedules. From the outside, I remained exactly what everyone expected me to be: reliable, efficient, quiet, and that was precisely why no one noticed what was changing. When people are comfortable with the role you play in their lives, they stop watching closely. They assume the pattern will continue indefinitely. That assumption gave me something valuable: space. Not space to plot revenge or dramatic confrontation. Those things rarely work in professional environments anyway, but space to observe more carefully than I ever had before. My black leather notebook slowly filled with small details that most people around me overlooked. I wrote down which clients asked specifically for operational clarity during meetings. I noted when executives praised work without realizing who had prepared it. I tracked timelines, especially the ones that shifted quietly after conversations with Daniel. One afternoon, I was reviewing the preparation for a quarterly presentation when something interesting happened. A senior partner named Margaret Ellis stopped by my desk. Margaret didn't work directly with our team often, but when she did, people tended to listen carefully. She had been with the firm for nearly 20 years and had a reputation for noticing things others missed. She glanced at the documents on my desk. "You prepared the logistics models for the North Atlantic project, didn't you?" she asked. I looked up, slightly surprised. "Yes." Margaret nodded slowly. "I thought so." She paused for a moment, then added something that felt more like an observation than a compliment. "You're very good at making complicated systems understandable." "Thank you," I said. Margaret gave a small smile and walked away. It was a brief interaction, less than 30 seconds, but it stayed with me for the rest of the day. Not because of the praise, but because it reminded me that visibility isn't completely random. Some people see more than others, and when they do, they tend to remember. That evening, I made another quiet note in my notebook. Margaret Ellis, aware of operational modeling. Moments like that weren't dramatic, but they were part of a larger picture that was slowly forming in my mind. At the same time, something else was happening in the background of my life. Wedding preparations were accelerating. Guest confirmations were arriving. Final venue details were being arranged. My parents had booked their flights weeks earlier. The date had been marked on my calendar for nearly a year: Saturday, June 14th. For most people, a wedding date is something sacred, an immovable point around which everything else adjusts. But in the office, very few people seemed to think of it that way. Daniel certainly didn't. He knew the date. I had mentioned it months earlier while organizing project schedules. But knowledge and attention are different things. One Thursday afternoon, during a meeting about an upcoming client review, Daniel glanced at the calendar projected on the wall. "We may need an additional strategy call with the client that week," he said casually. He pointed to a date on the screen: June 14th, my wedding day. For a moment, I assumed he simply hadn't noticed. So I spoke up calmly. "That's the day of my wedding," I reminded him. Daniel blinked once, as if processing the information. Then he nodded slightly. "Right," he said. "We'll figure something out." The meeting continued. No one else in the room reacted, and technically the issue seemed resolved. But the interesting thing about patterns is that once you recognize them, you start anticipating what might happen next. That evening, as I closed my laptop and placed my notebook back into my bag, I felt something unusual. Not worry, not frustration, just a quiet curiosity. Because after watching the system for so long, I had begun to understand how it behaved under pressure, and I suspected that when the moment came, The assumption about my availability would return one more time. The difference was that this time, I would be ready to see it clearly. And when you see something clearly enough, your response becomes much easier to choose. The discovery didn't happen all at once. There was no single dramatic email, no sudden realization that changed everything in a moment. Instead, it happened gradually over several weeks, through the same quiet observation I had already been practicing. The first clue appeared during a routine client coordination call. I was preparing the logistics briefing for a major account our firm had been working with for nearly 2 years. The client was a rapidly expanding supply chain company based in Toronto, and their European rollout depended heavily on the systems our team managed. Normally, Daniel led those conversations, but this particular call had been scheduled during a time he was traveling, so I joined alongside a few members of the client's internal operations team. It was supposed to be a short update, 30 minutes at most. About halfway through the conversation, one of their directors said something that made me pause. "Ruby, before we move forward," he said, "I just want to confirm something." "Of course. Are you still overseeing the operational modeling for the European distribution sequence?" "Yes," I replied. "Good," he said. "That part of the plan has been the clearest element of this entire project." I thanked him politely and continued the discussion. Again, the comment wasn't dramatic. Clients often expressed appreciation for specific parts of a project, but the tone of his voice suggested something slightly different. It wasn't just approval, it sounded like reliance. After the call ended, I reviewed the project documentation again, this time with a slightly different question in mind, not what work needed to be done, but the client believed was responsible for it. What I found was interesting. Over time, my operational models and planning frameworks had become deeply embedded in the way this particular client understood their expansion timeline. Even though Daniel was the official project lead, the systems guiding many of the decisions had been built through the operational analysis I had developed quietly in the background. In other words, the client trusted the structure of the project, and that structure came from my work. I didn't feel proud when I realized that. I felt calmer, clarity. The next confirmation came about 2 weeks later. Margaret Ellis stopped by my desk again while reviewing a quarterly progress report. She flipped through the few pages, then looked at me over the edge of the document. "You designed the European logistics framework, didn't you?" she asked. "Yes." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "I thought so." She tapped one section of the report. "This structure is the reason the client has stayed so confident in the project timeline." She closed the report and added something else. "Operational clarity like this builds trust." Then she continued walking toward the conference rooms without another word. Again, it wasn't dramatic, but hearing the same pattern reflected from two different directions confirmed something important. The leverage I had quietly built over years of careful work wasn't visible inside the office hierarchy, but it was visible to the people who depended on the results. Clients, senior partners, people who cared less about internal titles and more about whether systems actually worked. That realization didn't create excitement. If anything, it made everything feel simpler. For years, I had assumed that authority inside the company determined how much influence someone truly had, but influence is often more complicated than that. Sometimes the most important leverage doesn't come from titles, it comes from trust, and trust, once established, can't easily be reassigned just because someone else stands at the front of the meeting. I didn't plan to use that realization for anything, at least not intentionally, but it gave me something valuable: perspective. Because when you understand exactly where your real influence exists, you stop worrying so much about where it doesn't. The office still saw me as the quiet coordinator, the reliable person who made things run smoothly. But somewhere outside those walls, the systems I had built had become something else, a foundation that other people depended on. And that meant when the moment finally arrived, when Daniel made the assumption I had been quietly expecting, the outcome would not unfold the way he imagined. Not because I forced it, but because the truth of the situation would speak for itself. 3 days before my wedding, the message arrived. It was late afternoon, just as the office was beginning to settle into that quiet end-of-day rhythm. Most people had already finished their meetings, and the soft hum of keyboards had replaced the louder conversations from earlier. I was reviewing final logistics for one of our ongoing projects when my phone buzzed with a new email notification. From Daniel Mercer, subject, client call. Friday. At first, nothing about it felt unusual. Client calls were routine, especially near the end of a project phase. But when I opened the email, I noticed the date immediately. Friday, June 14th, my wedding day. The message itself was short. Ruby, the Toronto client wants a final strategy alignment call before the next phase begins. Friday morning should work for them. Please join the call and walk them through the operational adjustments. Daniel. No question, no acknowledgement of the date. Just the same quiet assumption I had seen so many times before. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. Not angry, not shocked, just thoughtful, because the situation felt strangely familiar. For years, small requests had arrived exactly like this. Brief instructions built on the expectation that I would adjust my life around the work. And for years, I had done exactly that. But this time was different. Not because the request was unreasonable in isolation. Client calls happen. Deadlines shift. The difference was the context. Daniel knew about the wedding. I had mentioned the date months earlier. It had even appeared in a shared calendar note when we organized project schedules for that quarter, which meant this message wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a continuation of a pattern, the assumption that my reliability would override everything else. I closed my laptop for a moment and leaned back in my chair. Around me, the office continued its usual routine. People are gathering their bags, quiet conversations about dinner plans and weekend trips. None of them knew about the email. And at that moment, I realized something important. I had three possible responses. The first was the one I had chosen many times before. I could simply agree. Adjust my wedding morning schedule, step into a quiet room before the ceremony, and lead the call as expected. Technically, it would solve the problem, but it would also confirm the assumption Daniel had relied on for years, that my time belonged to the system. The second option was confrontation. I could walk into his office and challenge the request directly, explain that asking someone to work on their wedding day crossed a boundary, but confrontation rarely produces clarity in professional environments. More often, it creates defensiveness. The third option was something quieter, something that matched the approach I had been practicing for months. I could simply tell the truth, that I would not be available. No explanation beyond that, no argument, just a calm statement of fact, and then allow the situation to unfold naturally, because by that point, I understood something Daniel did not. The client, whom he expected me to guide through the operational adjustments, had grown used to a very specific pattern. When they needed clarity about the project structure, they spoke to me, not because of my title, but because of the systems I had built over the past 2 years. For a moment, I considered whether explaining the situation further would help, but the more I thought about it, the clearer the answer became. No, sometimes the most honest response is also the simplest one. So I reopened my laptop, typed a short reply, and pressed send. Daniel, I won't be available on Friday. It's my wedding day. Ruby. No frustration, no justification, just the truth. After that, I closed the laptop again and began organizing the documents on my desk. Because once a decision has been made calmly, there's nothing left to debate. The next move would belong to Daniel, and the moment that followed would reveal exactly how deeply the old assumptions still ran. Daniel responded faster than I expected. Less than 10 minutes after I sent my email, my phone buzzed again. Ruby, the call can't be moved. The client specifically asked for the operational walkthrough. It'll only take 30 minutes. Daniel. I read the message twice. The wording was careful, not aggressive, not openly dismissive, but the meaning behind it was unmistakable. The assumption was still there, that the situation simply needed a small adjustment, that my personal plans, no matter how significant, could be rearranged if the client required something. For years, that assumption had been correct. This time, it wasn't. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I placed the phone on my desk and finished organizing the project documents I had been reviewing earlier. A few spreadsheets needed updating. A timeline summary needed to be archived in the shared folder. Normal work, routine tasks, nothing dramatic. About 20 minutes later, I picked up the phone again and wrote another short message. Daniel, I understand the importance of the call, but I will not be available on Friday. Ruby again, no confrontation, just clarity. After sending the email, I returned to my notebook and wrote down the date and time of the exchange, not as evidence, just as part of the record I had been keeping for months. Around the office, the day was ending. People were packing their bags, talking about weekend plans, and discussing restaurants and train schedules. To everyone else, it was an ordinary Thursday afternoon. No one noticed that a small decision had just shifted the direction of a much larger situation. At 6 o'clock, I closed my laptop, placed the notebook in my bag, and left the building. Outside, the air felt cooler than it had earlier in the day. London evenings often carry that quiet sense of transition, day fading into night, office lights reflecting softly on the wet pavement. On the train ride home, I checked my phone once more. There were no new messages from Daniel, which meant one of two things had happened. Either he had accepted my answer, or he had decided to solve the situation another way. I suspected it was the second option, because people rarely abandon long-standing assumptions immediately. More often, they attempt to work around them. That evening, Thomas and I finalized the last details for the ceremony schedule. My parents had arrived in the city earlier that day. The venue coordinator had confirmed everything was ready. The following morning would begin the quiet preparations leading up to the wedding. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't think about the office at all, because the decision had already been made. Whatever Daniel chose to do next would unfold without my involvement. The interesting thing about stepping away from a system, especially one that has relied on you for years, is that the effects aren't always visible right away. At first, everything looks normal. Emails still arrive, meetings still happen. But gradually, small gaps begin to appear. Questions that normally would have come to you start circulating elsewhere. Clarifications take longer to reach the right people. And sometimes, the people who depended on your quiet presence begin noticing that something is missing. Friday morning, while I was getting ready for the ceremony, Daniel would discover exactly how important that missing piece had been. Not through confrontation, not through revenge, simply through the reaction of someone he hadn't expected to ask a question. A question that would make the entire situation suddenly very clear. Friday morning arrived quietly, not with the tension of a workday, but with the slow, careful rhythm that belongs to important personal moments. I woke earlier than usual, not because I needed to, but because my mind was already awake. The hotel room where we were staying felt calm in that gentle way mornings sometimes do before a big event. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, and somewhere down the hallway, I could hear distant voices from other guests starting their day. For the first time in months, my phone stayed face down on the bedside table. No emails, no project updates, no meeting reminders. Thomas was already awake, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee. "Good morning, bride," he said with a quiet smile. I laughed softly. "Good morning." The morning moved slowly after that. Breakfast with my parents, a short walk through the hotel garden, the quiet preparation that leads up to a ceremony. Hair appointments, final adjustments to the dress, friends arriving with small bursts of excitement. At the office, however, the morning was unfolding very differently. I didn't know the details at the time. Most of what happened that day reached me later, through colleagues who described the situation with a mixture of confusion and reluctant amusement. The client's call with Daniel had scheduled for 9:30 a.m. According to Mark, who later told me the story, the meeting began normally. Daniel joined the video call. Several members of the Toronto client's leadership team appeared on the screen. The usual introductions happened. A few polite greetings, then the conversation turned toward the operational timeline adjustments for the European rollout. That was the moment the client asked a simple question. "Is Ruby joining us?" Daniel paused briefly before answering. "She won't be available for this call," he said. From his perspective, the explanation probably felt straightforward, but the client's reaction was immediate. "Oh," one of the directors said, "we thought she was leading this walkthrough." Daniel assured them the team had everything under control. He began explaining the operational changes using the presentation slides I had prepared earlier in the week. For a few minutes, the meeting continued. But as Mark later described it, something in the tone of the conversation shifted. Questions started appearing that were more detailed than usual, specific points about the logistics framework, clarifications about the modeling assumptions behind the shipping sequence. Normally, those questions would have moved directly to me. Instead, Daniel had to answer them himself. And for the first time in a long while, the conversation slowed. Not because Daniel lacked intelligence, but explaining a system is different from presenting it. Eventually, one of the client executives asked the question that changed everything. "Can we ask why Ruby isn't available today?" There was a short pause. Daniel answered honestly. She's getting married today. For a moment, the call went completely quiet. Then one of the directors responded in a tone that Mark later described as genuine surprise. You scheduled a project alignment call on her wedding day? It wasn't an accusation, just a question. But questions like that have a way of revealing assumptions that suddenly feel very visible. Daniel explained that the call had been difficult to reschedule. The client listened. Then someone on their side said something simple. Well, that explains a lot. According to Mark, the meeting ended earlier than planned. Not because anyone was angry, but the conversation had lost its usual flow. Without the person who normally translated the operational structure into clear explanations, the discussion simply slowed down. Back at the wedding venue, none of that tension existed. Music was beginning to play, guests were taking their seats, and for the first time in years, my attention belonged entirely to something outside the office. But several miles away, in a conference room filled with polite professional voices, something subtle had already begun to shift. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the quiet realization that the system Daniel relied on so easily had always depended on someone he assumed would never step away. I didn't hear about what happened after the call until the following week. At the time, I was busy with things that had nothing to do with the office. The ceremony itself was simple and warm. Family, close friends, the quiet happiness that comes from seeing people you love gathered in one place. There were speeches, laughter, a few emotional moments that passed quickly into celebration. For most of that day, my phone stayed tucked away in a small drawer at the venue. I didn't check it. And for the first time in years, the absence of notifications felt completely natural. Meanwhile, at the office, the situation that had started during the client call continued unfolding in ways Daniel hadn't expected. Mark told me later that after the meeting ended, Daniel remained in the conference room for a few minutes longer than usual. Not angry, just unsettled. Because the client's reaction had created a problem he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't about the missed call itself. Projects survive small disruptions all the time. The issue was the question the client had asked. Why isn't Ruby available today? And the follow-up realization that came immediately after. She's getting married today? Once that information was entered into the conversation, the dynamic changed. Because from the client's perspective, the situation looked different than it had inside the office. They had been speaking with someone whose operational work they trusted for nearly 2 years, someone they believed played a central role in the project's structure. And suddenly they learned that the same person had been expected to lead a call on her wedding day. No one accused Daniel of anything inappropriate. Professional environments rarely operate that way, but tone matters. And according to Mark, the tone of the follow-up emails from the client that afternoon carried a kind of polite distance that hadn't been there before. Requests for clarification, questions about documentation, several small details that suggested something subtle had shifted. Inside the office, Daniel began trying to smooth things out. He scheduled another follow-up meeting for the following week. He asked the team to review the operational documents again. But there was one detail he couldn't easily correct. The client had already formed an impression, not in conflict, but of imbalance. Later that afternoon, another message arrived from the client's operations director. It was brief. Daniel, for the next strategy review, we'd prefer Ruby to be present. Her explanations of the logistics framework have been particularly helpful for our team. The message wasn't critical. In fact, it was almost complimentary. But it carried an implication that Daniel hadn't expected to see written so clearly. The client had begun associating the clarity of the project with a specific person, not the title, not the role printed on the organizational chart, just the person who had quietly built the system they relied on. And because that realization had happened during a moment when Daniel appeared unaware of something important about his own team member's life, it created a small fracture in the professional image he had carefully maintained. Not a crisis, just discomfort. The kind that makes people replay a situation in their minds and wonder whether it could have unfolded differently. By Monday morning, when I returned from the weekend, the office atmosphere felt slightly quieter than usual. Not tense, just reflective. People greeted me politely. A few colleagues offered warm congratulations. Mark passed by my desk around mid-morning and said something with a small smile. "You missed a very interesting client call on Friday." I looked up at him. "Oh?" He nodded. "Let's just say The client was very surprised when they found out why you weren't there. He paused, then added thoughtfully, and not in the way Daniel expected. At that moment, I understood something simple. Sometimes the consequences of a decision don't appear through confrontation or arguments. Sometimes they appear through the quiet realization that certain expectations were never as reasonable as people assumed. And by the time that realization happens, it's usually too late to rewrite the moment that revealed it. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday afternoon, not by me, by Daniel, which in itself said something about the shift that had taken place. Months earlier, he never would have asked for a meeting. He would have simply walked into my office, leaned against the door frame, and started talking as if every conversation belonged to him by default. But this time, there had been a calendar invitation, a subject line, discussion, nothing else. When I arrived at the small glass conference room, Daniel was already there. He wasn't sitting the way he used to, relaxed, confident, filling the room like it was built for him. He sat straight, hands folded, not nervous exactly, but careful. The moment I walked in, he stood up. "Ruby," he said. "Daniel." I sat across from him, setting my notebook on the table even though I didn't plan to write anything. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Outside the glass wall, people walked through the hallway carrying coffee cups and laptops, completely unaware that the quiet gravity inside that room had been years in the making. Daniel finally cleared his throat. "I've been meaning to talk to you," he began. "I assumed so," I said calmly. He nodded slowly. "I didn't realize how much of the client structure ran through you." I didn't respond, not because I disagreed, but because the sentence itself already said everything it needed to, he continued. When the transitions started happening, when the clients began moving, it took me a while to understand what I was actually seeing. There was no accusation in his voice, just recognition. "I never thought you were planning anything," he admitted. "I wasn't," I said gently. He looked up. For the first time since I'd sat down, our eyes met fully. "I didn't plan anything," I repeated. "I just stopped pretending things were fine." The silence that followed wasn't tense. It was honest. Daniel leaned back slightly. "I owe you an apology," he said. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. Just a simple statement that took him longer to reach than he probably expected. "For the wedding day," he added quietly. I nodded once. "I know." He blinked, surprised. "You know, I knew the moment you said the call couldn't be rescheduled," I said. Another pause. "I thought you'd argue," he admitted. "I considered it. And I realized something important," I said. "What?" "That arguing with someone who doesn't see you doesn't make you visible." The words hung in the air for a moment. Not sharp, just true. Daniel rubbed his hands together slowly. "I misread you," he said. "Most people did. You were quiet. Yet, you never pushed back." "No." He let out a small breath. "I thought that meant you were comfortable where you were." I smiled faintly. It meant I was paying attention. That seemed to land somewhere deeper than anything else we'd said. Daniel looked down at the table for a moment before speaking again. "The company is trying to stabilize things," he said. "I heard. They'd like you involved." I tilted my head slightly. "In what capacity?" "Consulting, advisory, something flexible." I considered that for a moment. Not because I needed time to decide, but because moments like this deserve the dignity of thought. "I appreciate the offer," I said finally. "And I've already moved forward." Daniel nodded slowly. I figured. There was no frustration in his voice now, just acceptance. "I suppose this is the part where you say you never meant for any of this to happen," he said with a faint smile. I shook my head. "No." He looked curious. "I didn't cause it," I said, "but I didn't stop it either." The honesty of that seemed to settle something between us. For the first time in the entire conversation, Daniel relaxed slightly. "Fair enough." We sat there quietly for a few seconds. Then he asked the only question that really mattered. "Are you happy?" I didn't answer immediately, not because I didn't know, but because happiness isn't something you rush. Finally, I nodded. "Yeta." Daniel smiled, small but genuine. "I'm glad." We both stood. No handshake, no formal ending. Just two people who had finally understood something about each other. Years too late. As I walked out of the conference room, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not victory, not relief, just clarity. And clarity, I've learned, is quieter than people expect. A year has passed since the day I walked out of that conference room. long enough for the dust to settle, long enough for people to stop telling the story the way they first understood it, and long enough for me to understand something about myself that I hadn't fully seen before. My life now looks quieter from the outside, which is ironic, because people once assumed I was quiet due to hesitation, when in reality, quiet was always where my strength lived. I no longer work inside the glass building where I spent so many years organizing systems that few people noticed. Instead, I work from a smaller office overlooking a river that changes color depending on the time of day. In the morning, it looks pale and reflective. In the evening, it turns darker, almost thoughtful. The work itself hasn't changed as much as people might expect. I still analyze structures, still solving operational problems, still help organizations understand the things that quietly hold them together. But now the dynamic is different. Clients don't see me as the person who keeps everything running behind the curtain. They see me as the person who understands the curtain itself. And sometimes that small shift in perception changes everything. Thomas says I move differently now, not in some dramatic way, just lighter, less careful about making myself smaller in rooms where I belong. The funny thing is, I never consciously decided to become a different person. There was no dramatic moment where I promised myself I would never be overlooked again. Life rarely works like that. Instead, something simpler happened. I stopped explaining my worth to people who had already decided not to see it. Once that habit disappears, something interesting replaces it. Space. Space to work with people who listen. Space to step away from situations that require constant proof. Space to live without carrying the quiet tension of being underestimated. Daniel and I haven't spoken since that meeting. Not out of bitterness, just because our paths no longer intersect. Occasionally, I hear updates through former colleagues. The company eventually stabilized, new systems were implemented, new leadership structures formed. From what I've been told, things are functioning well again. And I'm genuinely glad, because despite everything, I never wanted the place to fail. It held a chapter of my life that shaped who I am. But chapters aren't meant to last forever. The wedding day Daniel once tried to schedule over still stands out in my memory sometimes. Not because of the conflict, but because of what it quietly revealed. For years, I believed strength meant enduring situations patiently, holding everything together, making sure things continued to work. And sometimes that is a strength. But there is another kind of strength people talk about far less: the strength of stepping away without anger, the strength of letting consequences unfold naturally, the strength of choosing clarity instead of confrontation. Looking back, the story people sometimes tell about me is that I outplayed the situation, that I somehow orchestrated the outcome. But the truth is much simpler. I didn't orchestrate anything. I just stopped compensating for a system that depended on my silence. And when silence is removed, structures reveal themselves very quickly. Now, when new clients ask how I learned to see operational dynamics so clearly, I usually smile and give them a practical answer about observation and pattern recognition, which is true. But it isn't the whole truth, because the real lesson had nothing to do with business systems. It had to do with people, and with the quiet moment when you realize you no longer need to prove your place in a room. When people hear this story, they often expect a dramatic ending, a moment of triumph, a confrontation that ends with someone finally getting what they deserve. But life rarely resolves itself with that kind of clean emotional punctuation. The truth is quieter than that. Nothing exploded. No one was publicly humiliated. There was no dramatic revenge. What happened instead was something far more ordinary, and in many ways, far more revealing. A pattern simply stopped working. For years, I had quietly supported a system that depended on two things: my reliability and my silence. Reliability kept everything running. Silence kept everything comfortable for everyone else. And like most systems built on unspoken expectations, it functioned smoothly. Until one of those expectations disappeared. The moment I stopped adjusting my life to maintain that balance, the structure had to reveal what it truly was. Not malicious, not evil, just built on assumptions no one had ever questioned. Daniel wasn't a villain. He was simply someone who had grown used to a version of reality that worked well for him. Many people do. And sometimes the only way those assumptions change isn't through arguments or confrontations. Sometimes they change when reality quietly refuses to bend anymore. Looking back now, the lesson I carry from that experience isn't about workplace politics or professional leverage. It's about something simpler. There is a difference between patience and invisibility. Patience means choosing your moment. Invisibility means waiting for someone else to give you permission to exist. For a long time, I confused the two. The day Daniel asked me to attend a client call during my wedding wasn't the moment everything changed. It was simply the moment that made the truth impossible to ignore. Not for him, for me. And once you see something clearly, you don't have to fight it. You just stop participating in it. The rest tends to unfold on its own. So now I'm curious about something. Have you ever experienced a moment like that? A moment where you realized the way people saw you wasn't the way you actually existed? And if you did you confront it? Or did you simply step away and let the situation reveal itself? I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments, because sometimes the quietest decisions end up changing the entire story.
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.